Title splitting is the idea of taking one property or one plot of land and splitting it into multiple ones, ultimately with the objective of making a profit. In this video, I want to explain exactly what it is and how it works. Hey, my name is Saj Hussain, and on this channel I share with you my 15 plus years of property investing experience to ultimately help you get further faster in your own property investing business. Title splitting is a really exciting strategy, one that enables you to make significant amounts of profit without doing a huge amount of physical work, because most of the work is a paper exercise that's done by the solicitor. The government has a department known as a land registry that keeps a record of all the property, the ownerships, the size of plots, and effectively a central database of all property information. The title register usually includes a title number, who owns the property, how much was paid for the property, i.e. what it was last sold for, if there's any mortgage on the property. It doesn't actually show you the amount, but if there's a lender that has an interest in the property. There may also be some restrictive covenants, certain agreements or promises that have been associated with that particular property or land, and if there's any easements, i.e. rights of ways that may be on that land as well. And in some cases, a title register may not include the details of restricted covenants or easements, but they'll say which documents they need to refer to for that information. The title plan, on the other hand, shows the general location and the boundaries of that particular property. An example of title splitting may be a developer purchasing a piece of land and, let's say, slicing it into 10 different plots. In this example, the original title effectively is scrapped and 10 new titles are created within its space. On the other hand, you might take, say, a large Victorian property, let's say it's over 3 floors, and that's been split into 3 or 4 apartments. And what you'll find there is that you'll have, say, 3 or 4 new title documents that are created. But in this particular example, essentially what you're doing is creating new leases. So title splitting is technically not the right term because you're creating new titles, but it's still seen as under the same concept, under the same banner of effectively creating more titles than you initially started with. So here the freehold title would remain in its place, and then you'd have 3 or 4 new leases that are created and leasehold titles depending on how many apartments are being created. The ultimate objective here is to be able to create a profit. So let's say that Victorian property we were referring to just now was purchased, let's say, for £300,000, and you're going to create 4 apartments with it. Let's say each apartment's worth £150,000. That's now giving you a total value of £600,000. Now, yes, you've got to do some work, some conversion work in terms of creating those apartments, but the real skill lies in identifying properties which already have been converted but maybe haven't had the correct legal work done, maybe they haven't quite been done correctly. So most of your work is involved in the paper exercise of correcting what may not have been done correctly in the first place. So many of these properties that have converted, say in the 70s and early 80s, they weren't necessarily converted to the correct building standards of the time. So what happens is those properties, because they were already up and running and have been operational for such a long time, they exist, but actually their values are quite limited. So that Victorian building with maybe 4 apartments in it can be possibly acquired for £300,000 because it doesn't have the right planning regulations. And that can quite easily be rectified in terms of getting a certificate of lawful use. But then those 4 apartments, now you can correctly have new leases established and 4 new titles created, hence worth £150,000 each and taking the value to £600,000. Now that's just an extreme example of numbers, but it shows the power of being able to split titles in this way using this paper exercise to create profit. Title splitting can be used in other ways as well. Let's say, for example, somebody has a retail unit, a shop, and it has a couple of apartments above it, which would be known as a mixed commercial property. And let's say, for example, they want to take a buy-to-let mortgage on that. The lender may not be happy with the fact that the property has mixed usage within that. They might just be happy lending on the apartments. So it may be those 2 apartments are created on new titles, separate leases. So now the building is created as 3 titles, 1 for the shop, 1 for each apartment, and each of those 2 apartments can have separate buy-to-let mortgages on those, and the shop might have a separate, say, commercial mortgage. Another reason why somebody might want to split titles in that same example, let's say they have a SSAS pension and the pension can only hold commercial property, so the property might get split, i.e. a new title created for the shop, and the shop is then owned within the SSAS, and the remaining 2 residential units kept however they were or in a different ownership. Overall, it could be the same owner, but they're owned through different structures in order to be able to satisfy their lender's requirements or pension requirements. In England, property can generally have either a freehold title or a leasehold title. So going back to the early example of the developer that buys a piece of land and slices that into 10 separate plots, that's effectively each one of those would be a freehold. So often that you'll find is houses are freehold, but it's not always the case. And then apartments, what happens, they are created as leaseholds, and the leasehold is you own the property but not necessarily the land that it sits on. So you might have some ground rent that you have to pay as well, which generally there's some changes in the law in June 2022, so now it's just a peppercorn rent, i.e. a negligible amount. And most apartments are leasehold, but again, it's not always the case, and it's important to check the titles, because sometimes you find some quirks where properties are being set up in a slightly different way. You might find leasehold houses, you might find freehold apartments, although it's quite unusual. If it's a leasehold title, it will be for a number of years. It means that the owner has the right to that property for a certain number of years, and often it's in excess of 100 years. And it may be over time that starts to reduce, but generally speaking, especially when you're purchasing newer property, there'll be 100 years plus on that lease. The person that holds that lease will also then have some obligations to the freeholder, i.e. the person that owns the building and the land that it sits on, to pay ground rent, as we talked about earlier on. That might be a nominal amount, but possibly service charges as well. That's to look after the ground, the building, the windows, the insurance. So there's a cost contribution that needs to be made there as well to the freeholder. Now, depending on the freeholder, the way they create these properties, sometimes they might deliberately structure in a way that actually that's a separate profitable part of the business. And there are companies that will purchase freeholds in order really to be able to collect ground rent, which is going forward now may not be the same as it was years ago, but also the service charge, i.e. the managing of those particular buildings. This is a fairly specialist area of property. In fact, most of it comes under law in terms of how it's created. It's the solicitors that do most of the work for you. But the key opportunity here is being able to spot and identify properties that maybe haven't been set up correctly, haven't been split correctly, and for you to go through that paper exercise. There's a property that I purchased a few years ago which had 3 apartments in it, but they were all set up as freehold units. I used one freehold block of 3 properties, and I split those up. There were also some challenges in terms of the paperwork wasn't correct when the initial split was actually done, and when I acquired those properties, there's a bit of paperwork to sort out, but effectively we created a massive uplift in value. In fact, we more than doubled the value of what we paid for those properties just by sorting out that paper exercise. So you can see why this is such an exciting strategy to use. However, as I said, it's a fairly specialist strategy, and if you want to learn more about this particular area, I have a great friend who's very knowledgeable in this area, and I'd like to bring him on for an interview. If that's something you'd like, make sure you pop in the comment section below. Enough people ask, then I'll make sure I get him on the channel for an interview to talk to us about some of the intricacies of how this works. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you do me a favor by clicking my face over here and subscribe to the channel. We've now hit 30,000 subscribers, and I really appreciate everything you've done to make that happen, because hey, if you weren't watching these videos, I wouldn't be creating them. So I really appreciate your love and support on that. And then what to do next is watch this video over here, which answers a question that a lot of people tend to ask around the ownership of a property, whether it should be in your own name or in a company name. So look forward to seeing you on this video over here.